Marvellous Medicine. Just waiting to see how people join us for a little bit. We'll get started there. Also, as well, if you've seen all the other videos, I know some of them are private, some of them aren't. So I'll probably be releasing all of them the public setting, so that we should be able to see them. Also, as well, just to give a heads up to everybody out there, if you're in isolation, do take care of yourself. Do stay in, and I hope you've got everything you need. Remember, with all them kids out there, keep doing your homework. And, oh, hello, we've got a couple of people on live now. So, hi guys. Right, so let's get started with the final one. Okay. Lockanory. Oh, here we go. Lockanory presents George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl. Hey, hey. Okay, so they were in the kitchen now, and the big stewing pot on the stove. All the things that Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. Come along, my boy. Which one did you put in first? This one, George said. Hair shampoo, and he emptied it into the pot. Oh, now the toothpaste, George went on. And the shaving soap. And oh, the nail polish. Keep at it, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure watching you work, lad. So, and squeezed all the things into the stewing pot. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the pot didn't seem as full as it would the first time. Now what did you do? Said Mr. Cranky. Did you stir it? No, I boiled it, said George, but not for too long. So, Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the pot, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wood spoon. It's not brown enough, George said. Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten. Well, what? Quick, tell me, because if we've forgotten even one thing, then it won't work, at least not in the same way. A quart of brown gloss paint. That's what I've forgotten, George said. Mr. Killy Cranky shot out of the house into his car like a rocket. He sped down and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George then poured the paint into the stewing pot. That's better, George said. That's more like the right colour. Oh, look, it's boiling, lad, it's boiling. It's bubbling. George, is it ready yet? It's ready, George said. Hope it is. Right, shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. Let's test it. Let's give some to chicken. Why don't you calm down a bit? Miss Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. Calm down? Said Mr. Cranky. You expect me to calm down? Here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George. Dip a cupful out in the pot and we'll go get a spoon. We'll give some to a chicken just to make absolutely certain. So, outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvellous Medicine, number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in the same silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding a spoonful of the Marvellous Medicine, number 2, over to him. Come on. Chicken, good. Chick. This one was a white chicken with black specks and feathers. It looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went, pick. The effect of medicine number 2 on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by Marvellous Medicine number 1. The chicken screamed and shot straight up into the air. Came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak. Bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer and longer. Its body stayed the same size, but 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. What's happening to it? Cried Mr. Cranky. Something's wrong, George said. The legs went on growing and growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air the chicken got. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long legs and an ordinary little... It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted aunts," said Mr. Killiecranky. "Oh, we've gone and done it wrong. This chicken's no good to anyone. It's all legs. Nobody wants chicken legs." "I left something out," George said. "I know you left something out, lad. Quick, have a think, boy. What was it you left out?" "I've got it. Quick, what was it, lad? What was it?" "Flea powder for dogs." "You mean you put flea powder in? First one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "But wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on the list?" "That we did not," said Mr. Cranky. I used some of that too." "Well, no wonder it went wrong." Already running to his car, and as soon as he could, he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. "Here it is," cried Mr. Cranky, rushing up to the kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder and 1 carton of brown shoe polish." So George poured the flea powder into the giant stewing pot, and he scooped out the shoe polish out of the can and plopped it in as well. "Right, stir it up there, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil, and we've got it this time. I just bet we've got it." After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been bought, took a cupful out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us by turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as big as footballs." "I hope you do better than last time," she replied. "Come on, chicken," said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. "Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. Come on, have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb stepped over. The cockerel looked at the spoon, and it went pick. Squawked the cockerel, shooting straight up in the air again and coming down. "Oh, watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." Mr. Killiecranky, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still, as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky. It's getting longer. I'll say it's getting longer." Mr. Cranky was surprised. "Last time it was the legs," said Mrs. Cranky. "But now it's the head. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck." The cockerel's body hadn't grown feet long. "All right then, George, let's have another go. What else have you forgotten out of this one?" I don't know," George said. "Oh, yes, you do, lad. Come on, have a think. There's probably one vital thing missing, and you forgot to remember it." I put in some engine oil from the garage. Did you have that on your list?" George said. The answer. "How much did you put in?" Half a pint." Mr. Killiecranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. "Oh, and some antifreeze. I've sloshed in a bit of antifreeze." Back once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half of the pint of the engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant stewing pot. "Hey, boil it up again," said Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it like we did the last time." George so boiled it and stirred it like he did the last time. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. "Don't forget, you don't just have to have the same, but you've got to have things. How could you possibly do that?" "Hey, you keep out of this," said Mr. Cranky with a stern snap. "We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You just see if we haven't." This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and when he'd boiled it for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. "You're going to have some very queer chickens around here if you go on like this. Dish it out, George. Give a spoonful to that one over there." And he pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and he held out the spoon with the new medicine nugget. He said, a little bit disheartened. Try some of this." The brown hen walked over, looked at the spoon, and went peck. "Ah, soon," it said, and a funny whistling noise came out of its beak with a "Watch it grow," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure about that," said Mrs. Cranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" "Well, give it a chance." They stood there, staring at the brown hen. "It's getting smaller," George said. "Look at it, it's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much that it was no bigger than a newly hatched chick. It looked utterly ridiculous. "Oh, there's still out, lad," Mr. Cranky said. "I can't think what it could be. We've tried everything." "Oh, give it up," said Mrs. Cranky. "Pack it in. You'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky was looking very forlorn at this point. George was looking pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking very slowly away on its tiny legs. At that, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and shouted, "What's going on down here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough to have sleep in the yard with the rice and the mats, but I'll be blown if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," said Mrs. Cranky. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute!" Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid that looked very much like tea. "Oh!" she cried. "Ah! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? But you got a cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish..." No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't..." "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No, Mrs. Cranky," she said. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter trying to stop me having breakfast, trying to starve me out." The horrid old woman smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's hot. Nice and hot. Go on, get it down you." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height, reaching out a huge horned hand. And George... No, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. Said Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's." "George's round here," shouted Grandma. "Is this George's that? Well, I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. "I drink it up. Bring it. Lovely cup of tea." "No!" the others cried, but it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp, she swallowed everything that was in it. "There!" wailed Mrs. Cranky. "You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4. And look what one tiny spoonful did to that old brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already beginning to pour out of her mouth, and she was starting to whistle, just like the hen had done. This is going to be interesting," Mrs. Cranky said, still grinning his head off. "Now you've done it," said Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," said Mr. Cranky. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's nose and her mouth and her ears, whistling as it came like a giant kettle. "Oh, she'll feel better as she's let off a bit of steam," said Mr. Cranky. "She's going to blow up," said Mrs. Cranky. A boiler's going to burst." "Well, better stand clear then," said her husband. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny over his head, and the whistling was so high, the shrill is. "Call the fire department," said Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hoses." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your hen under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with her head as high as the roof of the house. She was coming down fast. "Oh, what's this, George?" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard, flapping his arms around. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to her normal height. "Oh, stop! That's just about right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky, very anxiously. George looked as Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, and now then little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do you think I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How do you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "Oh, she's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully, "and she's getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." But I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is." "Well, catch her and pull." But by then it was shrinking and shrinking to the size of a matchstick, and shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hey, she's gone!" cried Mr. Cranky. "She's disappeared completely," said Mrs. Cranky. "Well, that's what happens if you grow up and you're grumpy and bad," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, that, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" Down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it all was really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Aye," said Mr. Cranky, "that she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a very brief moment, he touched with his very fingertips the edge of a magic world. Well, so that was Lockanory. So I hope you all enjoyed it. If you want another video, then put a comment down in the comments, and stay safe, stay inside. See you later.